of the term, but some of them might go into a short answer question. So the whole test is worth 20%, and we just broken it right in half. So the essay is worth 10 points, and then there's 10 short answer questions worth 1 point each. So here's the list of topics. They're not in any particular order. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the format of the test. So for the short answer question, you'll be asked to identify and explain the significance out of 15 topics. And 15 topics will be chosen on this longer list here. And then for each of those, I'll ask you to write a sentence that identifies the topic. So who, what, where, when. For when, just the dynasty is fine. I'm not looking for exact years or dates on anyone. And then another sentence that explains its significance. So 2 sentences for each short answer question. You shouldn't spend more than 2 minutes per question. I wagered many of this will be answered in a minute. So you shouldn't spend more than 20 to 60 minutes on that part. For at least 40, if not 45 minutes for your essay. And partial points will be awarded. So if you do, if you identify that you're not satisfied with significance or the other way around, you can get a half point. So you can get a half point or full point or 0 for each one. So to give you an example of what a short answer question answer might look like, the question is just topic. So I'll just list 15 topics and you choose 10 to identify and explain the significance of. So as long as it was on the test and we wanted to identify and explain the significance, as long as this is an example of what sort of answer you give. The name of the Chinese Warring States thinker, that's sort of who, where, it's all China right now, so that's pretty easy. And when. Also, this is a little bit trickier because you've also identified also the title of the book attributed to the man and his long life. And the significance of the book, at least, is the major work of Taoist philosophy, which deals with personal freedom. So that's sort of the structure of the two sentences we're looking for to identify and explain the significance of the topic. Before I move on to the essay portion, are there any questions on how the short answer works? Yes. I'm giving you an example question here, and I'm giving you all the topics here, so that's all that I'll be giving you. Really, past tests would just be more lists. So, and I'm changing the format a bit, actually, from last year. So I've only taught this one year before, which was the summer, and I'm changing it. So there's not really a database yet to give you, but this should be enough information for you to go and study. Any other questions on the short answer? Okay, so for the essay, I will give you 2 essay questions. You will answer one of them, give a bit of choice. And the essay questions will be built around these topics. So if you're familiar with these topics, you should have enough information to write the essay. And the instructions are a bit more involved. We're looking for a minimum of 500 words. That's different for everyone. I did a rough count in past test booklets, and people generally write about 100 words a page if they're writing double space, so it's about 5 pages at least. And I recommend that you do write double space. It helps us for legibility. It also helps you if you want to go back and scratch something out or revise something, you'll have space to do that. Ideally, you can do the whole test in one text booklet. So 1 or 2 pages for the short answer, hopefully 1 page. And then the remaining 5 or 6 pages for the essay. We'll have extra booklets if you need them. So a few things about the essay. It should be complete sentences and paragraphs, so I don't want just a list of points. It needs to be written in English. Of course, if you're talking about Chinese topics, whether they be book titles or places or dynasties or people's names or so forth, you use the Pinyin romanization as it appears in your textbook. If you don't get it exactly right, that's fine. Just approximate it the best you can. We'll probably be able to guess who you mean based on the context of what you're talking about. So don't sweat it if you don't think you're spelling things absolutely correctly. And the essay is not like the term paper, so I'm not giving you a statement that you agree or disagree with and you have to justify that. It's more a summary of your knowledge on a given topic and different sources. So I'll give you a specific question on or combining some of these topics. And then you are answering that question by showing that you've absorbed some of the knowledge over the first part of this course. So a good strategy for doing this. You don't have to adhere to this, but I find that sometimes students like some concrete instructions about how they might go about structuring an answer. But a good strategy would be, in your first paragraph to explain the topic and time period in general and region you'll be addressing. And then by the end of that paragraph, give a general answer to the question. And then a brief list of your main points that you're going to make in your argument in support of that answer. That answer is really your thesis statement. And then the rest of the essay, the bulk of the essay, will be a series of paragraphs that state the specific points you're making in your argument to support your answer. And then those points need to be supported with specific reference to events, people, places, ideas, institutions, or sources. This is not an exhaustive list here. We're just looking for specifics that you learned from the course to support your points. No footnotes are required. You don't have to memorize exact quotations. Paraphrasing is acceptable. If you can't remember the exact title of the sutra, for instance, and you get it close enough that you figure out what sutra you mean, that's acceptable. Because this is not an open book test. You don't have access to your books, so we can't expect you to have perfect recollection of everything. So get it as close as you can. If you really can't think of the title of something, you can even explain it. So you can say, that legalist text that was the basis of Chin, the dynastic law or something. That's not an ideal solution, but it's better than writing nothing, right? So if you can't remember exactly what it is, you can explain what you mean. And feel free to cite multiple pieces of evidence for each of your points. You don't have to have just one point, one piece of evidence. And you can also mix it up a bit, comparing contrast your points in the essay. Ideally, points build upon each other, or one point might be a sort of corollary or a converse way of looking at something. But if you just want to stick to just a list of points, that's fine. But feel free to get creative if you want to in the section. And then the conclusion, of course, I always say conclude by restating what you said at the outset, which always seems like such a simplistic way of doing things. It's a good idea to restate your answer now that you've proven it, but I like the conclusion to go a bit beyond that. And to relate your answer, conclusion, past to something else you've learned in the course, or often in answering something, other questions will arise, like, well, what about, if you look at it this way, now we know this, well, what about this? Or perhaps this answer would be better if we knew more about this. So perhaps thinking of a question that comes out of your answer would be a nice way of defining that conclusion. So conclusions are sort of related to the larger field of knowledge, or conclusions should give you directions for where you might go from there. And even though this is just a short midterm essay, it's a good chance to think along those lines. And if you have time and inclination, you can do both of those things. So, I've given you one example of an essay question. I'm not giving you the essay questions ahead of time. I'm giving you these topics that you're familiar with. You won't know the essay questions when it appears. There'll be two, you can choose one. I'm giving you an example of one here. This will not be on the test. One that appeared on the test during the summer. Of the different 100 schools of thought mentioned in your textbook and primary source reader, which do you feel will make the best philosophy for governing an empire, and why? For specific aspects of the school, or previous aspects with other schools. So often I'm not looking for a right or wrong answer, and people in the course of answering this question over the summer, some people chose legalism, some Confucianism, some Taoism, some a combination of. They used evidence that legalism was very successful in founding the Qin, but then other people said no, legalism wasn't successful in the Qin in the last 15 years. There are all sorts of different ways you can answer this sort of question. So I'm trying to keep the question a bit more open-ended so you can bring in knowledge from different sources. I'm not going to make it so specific that if you didn't study that particular topic you're lost. It'll be a bit more general so that you can hopefully draw upon not only what you just studied, particularly for this test, but hopefully what you can go over the past few weeks in your reading and in lectures. And when we approach your essay, we'll be looking at three different things, and it's not a rigid point system, so we won't actually mark you that you got 3 out of 4 on this, or 1 out of 2 on this. This is to give you an idea of the sort of relative emphasis we're putting on the different aspects of your essay. So we're looking for, first of all, parity of expressions, that's 2 out of 10 points, sort of in the back of our mind as we're grading these. And that's just proper sentences and paragraphs, as well as the overall essay structure, so you kind of have that introduction and developing an argument and conclusion. But the bulk of what we're looking for, 8 points out of 10, half of them will be the main points of your argument. These don't have to be original, but they should be relevant to the question being asked. And then the other half would be your evidence or information, so your specific references to sources, events, people, etc., ideas from reading in your sentence lectures that go to support the point. This will be discussed tomorrow in the tutorial, along with another handout with more specific strategies for how to approach both short answer questions and the essay questions. You'll get a chance to discuss this in more detail with your TAs, but they didn't have a question about it right now. Okay, this is posted, as you see here, already on Blackboard, so that's ready to go. I also posted the last week's lecture slides up there. And then at the beginning of this week, I posted the handout that I showed you on Thursday of the term paper topic. And that will come up repeatedly over the next few tutorials as well, as we move closer to the first deadline for the draft on the 10th of November. Okay, so right now, let's turn to finishing up Xin and Han, and then moving on to the age of disunion and advent of Buddhism in China. Briefly went over these different social groups organized by relative power in the Han Dynasty. And I talked about how there was social mobility between these groups. And also, one thing I wanted to point out is many of the records we have, historical records we have for this period, and this is true for most East Asian kingdoms and dynasties, most of those records are written at the elite level of the educated scholar official court. And so we have a very kind of limited view, a top-down view, that we can build of history of these times. So what I always like to point out is my own bias. Literary scholars or other sources of history do other points of view. And poetry often comes not only from scholar officials, we have much poetry from scholar officials, but also is poetry that at least purports to speak from the point of view of common farmers, even soldiers. I'm not sure much poetry by convicts and slaves, although they do share characters and stories sometimes. But I wanted to give voice to these two poems that were collected in the Han Dynasty. They were brought into court by a music bureau that was established by Emperor Wu. Remember, Emperor Wu, he was the one who established the School of Confucian Learning and the sort of teach chairs and universities and so forth. He's the one that expanded the Han Dynasty to its greatest extent. And another legacy he left was the founding of a music bureau within the court. And the job of the music bureau was to collect poems and songs from all over the empire and bring them into the court to perform them for the emperor. And this is supposedly a way that the emperor could look into the hearts and minds of his people. If you remember, the promise of the Confucian classical poetry is that it articulates through external verbal words what is internal or in the heart and mind. So this is supposed to act as a window that the ruler could use to look into the hearts of the people and then cast judgment for all these rules. But these ones are, this one is in the voice of soldiers being left unburied on the field after a battle, being food for birds, and the people that think about their sacrifice. And then this one here seems to be in the voice of probably a peasant family, a farming family, who they had their grandfather kidnapped and being held for ransom, and so they have to sell off their livestock in order to pay the ransom. But an interesting part here is I look back and see the wardens coming, my heart fails and goes cold. The warden, or li in Chinese, is a term for a government official, and these are the people who collect taxes. So there seems to be a connection between this kidnapping and the people who are collecting the taxes. Perhaps the family is behind in paying the taxes, and so the government officials, the warden, kidnapped their grandfather and held a ransom until they paid their taxes. But certainly there's some problem, some note of protest and fear and suffering that's being placed upon the peasant family by the government. So these are interesting, these sort of poems that come out as a sort of alternative voice, often critical of the government. Now, I should put these in brackets and say these may very well have been later literary recreations by these scholar officials of what they thought might have been written at the time, what sounded like a good folk song at the time. We have no way of telling whether this really came from folk, quote unquote, in the Han Dynasty or not. The very fact that these voices would be preserved, I think, is interesting. Now, I told you I'd also like to make you aware of sources of history rather than just give you the history. And the major source for the Qin and the Han period, and actually for much of Chinese history before the Han Dynasty, comes from one book that went through the hands of one man. His name is Sima Qian. And he lived during the reign of Emperor Han Wu, or Emperor Wu, in the Han Dynasty. He served as a court astrologer. And his father was a court astrologer before him. And they both had access to the library, the imperial library, which was full of, I don't know how many books at that time, maybe, might have gotten into the thousands, I'm not sure. As part of their job as being astrologers, they had to keep track of the calendars and the records and so forth, so they had access to the library. And Sima Qian's father, Sima Han, took it upon himself a private project to compile a history of China from earliest times, from the time of the Xia Dynasty and Shang Dynasty, right through to the Han Dynasty, up to the reign of Emperor Wu. And this is part and parcel of that larger Han Dynasty project of systematizing all knowledge, right? Whether that be cosmology or philosophy, or classics. It's attempts that seem to be sort of permeating the Han zeitgeist, if you want to call it that, of trying to systematize everything. And so Sima Han was trying to systematize, give one consistent record of the past. He died before he completed the project. And on his deathbed, he made his son, Sima Qian, promise that he would continue the project and finish it. And Sima Qian did finish it. Unfortunately, in order to finish it, he was still the astrologer at court, and he was still, talking to the emperor on a regular basis. And he once remonstrated with the emperor. And this is what every good Confucian official should do. If the emperor is doing something incorrect, according to Confucian morality, it's the job of the official to point that out to the emperor. This is good in practice, or good in theory, but in practice can often get you in trouble. And Emperor Wu was criticizing, was going to punish an official, not an official, a general. Li Ling, who was out on the frontier defending the Han Dynasty against the attack from the Turkish. And he lost, he was defeated, and the emperor was very upset about that and was going to punish Li Ling for that. And Sima Qian, not Li Ling, sorry, General Li. And Sima Qian pointed out to the emperor, when you didn't send reinforcements to him, you didn't give him proper support, he was left him out there alone, so it's not his fault that he was defeated. And the emperor was so furious with Sima Qian that he sentenced him to castration to become a eunuch, which is really a death sentence. There's only half people survive that, and it's such a humiliating experience that you're supposed to choose suicide over becoming a eunuch. But Sima Qian made this promise to his father to complete the historical record, so he chose to become castrated so he could live on and complete it. And that decision fundamentally shaped the nature of this work, historical records. And since this work fundamentally shapes the whole tradition of Chinese historiography, it's a very key decision in how Chinese history was written and conceived of later. In that, Sima Qian saw this work, historical records, as his opportunity to, if he couldn't put his will into practice as an official, and he suffered castration and he was banished and had nothing left to do but write this book, that could be compensation, that somehow his will, his ambition, his virtue could come through in this literary production of history. It can come through in actual action. And as well, he saw this as a vehicle for being remembered, to make a name, a reputation, the Chinese term is name, for himself. And he was very successful in that account, because this has survived intact to the present day. There are 130 volumes. There they are there. I'm not going to put that on the midterm, don't worry. There's 130 volumes that he put together in the work, and they've all survived to us intact from the time of 2nd century BCE to the present day. And it's our primary textual source for the Qin and Han dynasties and the Pre-Qin as well. And it contains the stories of Liu Bang and Xiang as well, the battle between the Qin and the Han. In the letter, briefly talk about this letter. It's one of the most famous letters in Chinese history. It was written in reply to a man named Renan. Sima Qian wrote it, and Renan said, you were an educated person, you were a great official, and you should recommend like-minded men serve the government. And Sima Qian was a bit bitter, of course, by how he was treated by the emperor, so he turned down that request, and then gave his reason for why he would rather work on this work of history. And he gives a couple of reasons that he despised perishing without letting the glory of my writings be shown to posterity. So history becomes a way of capturing the memory, letting it live on, and there's a kind of struggle that often goes on in Chinese history between the primacy of the military, or wu, martial, and the civil, or the literary or cultural limb. And this is an argument, of course, that the civil or the cultural always went out because they're the ones that are allowed to make the record that survive. The general died on the battlefield, but these civil or literary documents persist. He has this idea of literary production, or not only literary, but verbal production, as coming from an expression of outrage. Right? That men who are not able to put their way into practice will express themselves through writing. And he says that Confucius did this in the Analects. He said that all of the books of poems, the Shijing, the poetry classics, are examples of this. The Zuo tradition, the source of Eastern Zhou history, so that was an example of that. So all these great works of the Confucian classics themselves, great works of literature, come from this idea of trying to give vent to your frustration through literature. And then here he talks about how he's sort of making what's called sui generis work, right? Which is that no one had ever written a history like this before. So it started a genre itself, and it became a model for all later Chinese historical writing. And the reason he wanted to do this comprehensive history is not only to give a true account of events in the past, but look for principles within history behind success and defeat and rise and fall. The interaction between heaven and man, and show the continuity and transformation of the past and present. So this is that sort of Han Dynasty impulse of trying to draw everything together in a systematic way. So history is also part of that project. You tie history to the unfolding of the cosmos, and there are principles that will discern in history that will help you explain it. And so he bore the punishment of castration in order to complete this project. And it was highly successful, which here we are talking about it today, years later, along the way. Also the theme of suffering, humiliation in order to achieve a greater goal appears again and again throughout the story of the fully half of the historical record. Fully half of these 130 volumes are given to, actually over half, are given to biographies. They start here. So yeah, from 61 to 129 are biographies, collected biographies of famous people throughout history from earliest times right up until the Han Dynasty. So he starts out with, he even has, I can't see it right on top of my head, but Lord Millet, the sort of lord who was the founder of the Zhou Dynasty of the Zhou people, before the Zhou Dynasty was founded, gives his own biography in there. Xu Yan from the king of Chu of the south, gives his own biography in there. As well as assassins, many women get biographies in there. Women that have married into the imperial families. Even at the end has biographies of humorists, like Jeffrey the Fourth, wandering knights, merchants, and so forth. Good people, quote unquote, and bad people, quote unquote, all find their way into here. So, and in each of those stories is given a sort of pattern. So not only is this a pattern of how history was written afterwards, but the reading of human character also finds patterns in here. So you'll find in later historical works as well as later literary works that there are these sort of common patterns of types of persons, types of people, and the expectations you have for them are shaped by many of these early biographies of famous people. So I can't overstate the importance of historical records. But the most immediate influence was it provided a model for a man named Bang Gu to write a history called the Han Hu, Han history. And the difference between this one and this Sima-Tian historical records is Sima-Tian historical records has the history of multiple dynasties from the very beginning of time and the sort of mythical sage emperors up to the Han dynasty. Bang Gu, who was in the Eastern Han, the second half of the Han dynasty, only wrote a history of the Western Han. The beginning of the Western Han until the usurpation of the throne by Wang Hong. And so that was the first dynastic history, a history that was dedicated to this one dynasty. And that set the model thereafter. For every ensuing dynasty, the first thing they would do would be open up the archives of the previous dynasty and write the official history of it. Which is kind of unusual, because what that means is each Chinese dynasty already, in keeping with archives, had an acknowledgement, tacit acknowledgement that they would end one day, that their dynasty would come to an end one day. And when it did, these records that they were preserving would be opened up by the next dynasty to write the history of them. So history was actually considered a kind of objective sacred task. The records that were kept day by day of what the emperor was doing and saying and so forth were called the shulu, or the veritable records. They were not allowed to be tampered with. The emperor himself was not allowed to alter them or suggest what historians should be considered. That was a precedent actually set earlier on in the Warring States period. There's a famous story of a king who didn't like what the historian was writing down about what he had said, and he told the historian to change it. The historian refused, but he executed the historian. And the historian's son came to this place and wrote the same thing down again. So he had him executed. And then the uncle came and wrote the same thing down again, and he had him executed. And I think after executing 3 of them, he realized that he wasn't going to be able to extinguish this position. Right? You can maybe kill the person occupying it, but the duty of reporting what the king says he does in a truthful fashion, he couldn't stop doing that. So he gave up, and the record was preserved. So that sort of sacred duty of history became encoded into the way each dynasty would write history previous times. So Bang Gu wrote the first dynastic history, and by present day there are now 25 of these dynastic histories. There is actually a draft history of the Qing dynasty, because no imperial dynasty followed the Qing dynasty. No one's actually written it. No one's undertaken that job. It is in draft form, a huge draft history of the Qing dynasty. I don't think that's included in the 25 histories. The 25 histories are all different dynasties which have their own separate histories. Ban Zhao is an interesting figure here. She was Bang Gu's sister, and she helped history as well, write history. It was sort of the same model as Sima-Tian starting it, his son Sima-Tian finishing history. Bang Gu's father started the Han history, which was continued by Bang Gu, and then he couldn't finish it because he got thrown in jail, and so did his daughter, my sister. His sister, Bang Jiao's father. So Bang Gu's sister, Bang Jiao, finished it. And the emperor was so impressed with the work that he sort of hired her to be a scholar and a teacher at the court to educate the women of the imperial house. She taught subjects like mathematics and philosophy, and wrote her own book called Admonitions for Women, and served as an advisor to the emperor as well. So the first female Chinese historian. Okay. And the last thing, before we move on to today's lecture, that I want to talk about in terms of the legacy of the Western Han Dynasty is the beginning of the Silk Road. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about Buddhism entering China. So you can see in the sort of inset map here, this is the extent of the Han Empire, and this is the sort of trade routes that were opened up all the way through Central Asia. And this again was under the reign of Emperor Wu, who was actually not interested in trade. It was for military reasons. He was sending envoys to Central Asia to try and get the nomads that lived in this region to join him and his army to fight against the nomads in the north. So it was more of a military task. All right. Kind of takes the touchpad quite often. But no one wanted to join him militarily. But plenty of people were willing to trade, particularly for Chinese silk. And so Chinese influence extended into Central Asia. at this point through trade more than for military events. Like, although they did have garrisons, military garrisons protecting the trade route so that the caravans could travel without the relations. And this is the beginning of an influx of foreign culture and foreign ideas and foreign technology into China over the Silk Road, which reaches a height later in the Tang Dynasty. So I've just listed there quickly for you the sort of legacy of this first age of empire. It started with the Qin and was consolidated by the Western Han, which was to expand China's territory to new large extent, as well as to reconceive that territory as all being contiguous and under the rule of one man, the emperor, rather than being a collection of separate states or separate kingdoms or even separate countries. You can almost think of them was the model before Qin time. The establishment of Confucianism as a state doctrine takes place in the Han Dynasty and never really went away. Other emperors toyed with different state doctrines. The famous empress who ruled as emperor decided that Taoism was a more friendly doctrine to women and tried to use that for a little while. But Confucianism was the sort of mainstream state doctrine from this point forward, as well as a written set of Confucian classics. So this is a transition, and I've discussed this before, from a world of oral culture to a world of written culture. So in the time of Confucius, most of this knowledge that we call Confucian classics would be formed in a ritual fashion or alphabet or uttered or sung, which was a poem, and heard and memorized that way, and only occasionally written down. With the establishment of the university and so forth, we have now a written set of Confucian classics, which then later go on to form a curriculum for the examination system, the imperial examination system, which comes later, which is used to choose scholars who will serve the course. And then finally, the last 2 points that is made today, establishment of official dynastic histories and the opening of trade with the West. All right, so I'll start, before we take a break, I'll briefly start by finishing off the Han Dynasty in this period of political division, and we'll end up with literature today. So we're moving right along. I've given you these this sort of periodization of Chinese history, which is my own devising, with these approximate years here. So we're now moving into the Han, and today we'll go through the three kingdoms and six dynasties as well. And so what we're going to talk about now is a period of when the empire then evolved into chaos and then was reunified and then dissolved again. So sort of oscillation between empires and things. Actually, I came across, if you're having trouble remembering all these dynastic titles, there's a song which you can use, which is to the tune of Pharaoh Jacques, don't excuse me. It goes, Shangzhou Qinhan, Shangzhou Qinhan, Wei Tang Song, Wei Tang Song, Yuanqing Republic, Yuanqing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong. Notice though, that ditty actually skips over all periods of disunion. They didn't work in the three kingdoms or three dynasties. But it's pretty useful to remember first applause about my singing ever. Okay, so let's zoom in on these periods. And once again, don't be scared by this. I'm not asking you to memorize these dates or even to know all these dynasties, but I think it's useful to have it there so you can refer to it. So I'm starting off today talking about the Eastern Han and how it evolved into the three kingdoms. The first part of what talk about this period. So we're now in, this is an old chart, AD, the Common Era, in the first century of the Common Era. And that is timeline, no. So, in terms of the Eastern Han, so up here, the reason it's broken into Western and Eastern Han is because there was a usurpation of the throne in the very early of the Common Era, the 9 to 23 of the Common Era. And after that usurpation, when the Liu clan, the ruling clan, was put back on the throne, they decided to move their capital from the west of Chang'an to the east in Loyang. So that's why it's called Western Han, Eastern Han. And there were a variety of sort of reasons that led to the downfall of the Eastern Han, which are useful to know because they come up again and again throughout history of Chinese dynasty. The Qin never really established its power on a solid basis. It was using military force to force people to subject themselves to their rule. And the second, that military force was in the hands of an incompetent ruler, the son of the first Qin emperor. It was no longer able to maintain control, and the empire fell apart. And then I talked about how the Han Dynasty put a whole sort of infrastructure into place, not only a physical one building upon the accomplishments of the Qin, but also an ideological one through literature and philosophy and history, and as well brought in policies which were kinder to the people, more the hearts and minds of the people. So the Han Dynasty had a pretty good run. If you don't count the usurpation of Wang, and you take the Western Han and Eastern Han together, it's about 400 years, or over 400 years of rule. So what brought down the Eastern Han? Well, the usurpation, to some extent, did weaken the control of the center. Anytime that the throne is usurped, even for a brief time, it brings into question the authority of the throne. And then sort of regional commanders and officials, and particularly military commanders, start to question whether they really should litigate someone that was thrown off the throne so easily. But there were more systemic factors. One was an economic one, which was over the course of the Western Han, there were wealthy families that amassed more and more land, and many sort of peasants and farmers couldn't hold on to their land anymore, and were basically reduced to serfs, sharecroppers that were just farming for someone else and didn't own their own land. And when that happened, those pieces of land were taken off the taxation rolls because the family was just taxed once. It didn't matter how much land it had. So what happened was the taxation base started shrinking and shrinking as richer and richer sort of landowners amassed more and more wealth. It's like what's happening in the U.S. right now. Same sort of idea where the people who actually pay the taxes are being disenfranchised while the wealth is being influenced. And so that meant there wasn't much tax coming into the coffers of the imperial court. And then at the same time, there was a lot of factional intrigue happening in the court itself. You remember I talked about the imperial family and the eunuchs, as well as the in-laws, the women married into the imperial family through becoming empresses and consorts and concubines and so forth. And the scholar officials who ran the bureaucracy, running the empire from day to day, they were basically four different power centers. So the imperial family, the dispatch side, the in-laws, eunuchs, and scholar officials, and they were all struggling back and forth for power. And this sort of grew into a pathological degree in the Eastern Han Dynasty. And the eunuchs in particular became quite powerful to the point where they could purge any officials that questioned their power or their legitimacy. So over the course of the Eastern Han, hundreds and hundreds of officials were thrown in prison and died, or were stripped of their titles for life by powerful eunuchs. So you're having less money coming into the center. The center itself is fighting and losing its ability to govern from day to day. And what happened was many officials became disillusioned with the whole idea of service. So many of the best officials left service altogether because they were afraid they were getting thrown in jail by eunuchs. So many of the best officials who run the empire were now withdrawing from service. So that was all very tenuous, but it could have lumbered along perhaps for a little while, except a rebellion broke out called the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184, which you're coming out. It was a sort of religious, millennial end of the world type of rebellion, which drew support from disenfranchised peasants who no longer had any land and nothing to lose, so they joined the rebel forces. The Eastern Han was able to put down the rebellion by giving military commanders throughout the empire wide latitude of independence to exert their authority. Once the rebellion was put down, those military commanders did not want to give back that authority. And then, from then on, it was a pretty quick descent into warlordism in China at that point. So the empire kind of broke up into power centers controlled by different warlords. And the last Han emperors in Eastern Han were sort of boy emperors, and were just puppets that were controlled by one warlord or the other. And this inaugurates a period called the Three Kingdoms, one of the most famous historical periods in Chinese history. And the major warlord in the north was a man named Cao Cao, who lived from 155 to 220. So he actually dies right at the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period. Interestingly enough, his father was the adopted son of a eunuch at the Han Dynasty court. So he kind of came from a eunuch family, although it happened to adoption for obvious reasons. The eunuchs can't have their own court. So he kind of came out of that alternate group of power, and he gained control over the last emperor of the Han Dynasty. Instead, he was protecting him from rebel forces, but really was establishing his own power base in the north of China. And his son, Cao Cao's son, Cao Zhi, founded the Wei Kingdom, and posthumously declared his father, Cao Cao, the first emperor of the Wei Kingdom. And from that point forward, the Han Dynasty was broken up into the Wei Kingdom in the north under the Cao family. The Liu clan, who were the rightful heirs to the throne of the Han Dynasty, retreated to Shu, which is modern-day Sichuan, which was a very secure base because Shu was surrounded by very tall mountains and only a few passes to get into it. So traditionally, that's where Chinese emperors would go in times of chaos to protect themselves. So the Liu clan had a power base there under a man named Liu Bei. And then the southeast was under the control of the Sun clan, which was Sun Xin, who they founded a kingdom called Wu. So Wei, Wu, Shu were the three kingdoms in this period. And there are many stories that come out of the Three Kingdoms period, and many of you are probably already familiar with them. Of course, there's the novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a very famous novel. There's a historical work called The Record of the Three Kingdoms, on which the novel is based. And then modern times, of course, countless movies, comic books, video games, trading cards, you name it, based on all the famous generals and all their battles in the Three Kingdoms. So the one that stands out the most, one of the most famous characters is Zhuge Liang, who was a famous military strategist who served the kingdoms of Shu. In historical records, he's portrayed as being an extremely wise strategist. By the time you get into the more literary, romantic accounts, he's given sort of magical powers like a wizard almost, or a Merlin. But I'll give you two examples of his military strategy. One was that the Shu forces were stretched out along a long front, and they weren't able to protect all their cities. One city was going to be attacked by enemy forces, and they sent for help, and Zhuge Liang said, well, we can't help you. So what I want you to do is open up your city gates wide, and then just go about your day as if nothing's wrong. And it's really crazy. But, well, why would we do that? It's just custom to do it. And so they did. They opened up the city gates, and they went to market. Everyone pretended in the city like nothing was wrong. The enemy forces came to reconnoiter, get intelligence, and they looked at the city, and they saw everything normal, no preparation, and they said, oh, this must be an ambush. There must be a way for us to attack, and the Liu's forces are going to attack. So they retreated, and they went home and didn't attack. This is Chinese military strategy, not going to war, right? That's the essence of it. It's from the twins of Bing Pa, they retreated to war. The best warriors are the ones that don't have to fight. The most famous battle took place along the Yangtze River here, the shores of the Yangtze River, between Wei and Wu. There's a place called Red Cliff, where Cao Cao was trying to take his forces from the north and push into the south and take the south, and from there he go into Shu, and then take the entire region of his empire. And so the Yangtze River at that point is actually quite wide. In some places the Yangtze River you can't actually see across it, so it's so wide. So you really need a navy to get across there. And Cao Cao was not familiar, being in the north, there are not as many rivers and lakes and so forth, so he wasn't familiar with naval maneuvers. And so he had all his ships chained together because he thought that would be more stability, and was going to cross the Yangtze attack. The night before, Zhuge Liang realized that his forces were short on arrows. They didn't have enough arrows, and they wouldn't be able to make enough arrows in time to ward off the attack. So he suggested that his generals take their ships and put straw men dressed as soldiers on them and run them by Cao Cao's forces on the north shore. And they did that, and of course it was the middle of the night, and as Cao Cao saw all these ships coming, they started firing all these arrows. The arrows stuck into the straw men, and then took the ships back and pulled out all the arrows. And they had all the arrows, and Cao Cao didn't have any arrows. So it was pretty smart. And then the final stroke of brilliance he had was when Cao Cao did, in the morning, launch his attack and try and come across the river with his navy. He ordered that fire arrows be shot into the sails. And the entire navy just went up in flames because they're all chained together. The fire leapt from ship to ship, and Cao Cao was defeated. It's very, very famous battle. Probably is a great movie about it too. Okay, I'm getting carried away telling all these stories of battles. So let's take our break at 2:05, and we'll come back at 2:15 and continue with some more mundane stuff.
睡过了。 说你睡过头的时候，你是1点半开始。不是吗？所以你已经回到家了。哦，那你还要借书？我等一下会提前去图书馆，就调理。对。我在问你说你坐哪，然后你又没回。是。Did we give a handout on the key point about it?
Yeah, don't follow already.
Photo 上面。所以你为什么要用这个？是哦。我回到家再打，可是可能会有点。OK 啊，那我晚上再跟你。谢谢。拜拜。
looked at how much we have to go through, and in 45 minutes, quite a bit. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. I misspoke earlier actually when I said Cao Cao's son, Cao Zhi, founded the Wei Kingdom. It wasn't Cao Zhi, that's one of the other sons. It was Cao Pi, the emperor. Second emperor of the Wei Kingdom. We founded the Wei Kingdom, called Cao Cao's father, the first emperor. And Cao Cao had another son named Cao Zhi. And Cao Pi and Cao Zhi were rivals, and Cao Pi was quite jealous of Cao Zhi, because Cao Zhi, his younger half-brother, had a great talent for literature. And a talent that actually impressed their father, Cao Cao, so much that Cao Cao at one point was thinking of making Cao Zhi his heir to the throne rather than Cao Pi, even though Cao Pi was the older son. But eventually Cao Pi got the throne, and he set about persecuting his younger brother Cao Zhi thereafter. And there's a very famous encounter between the two of them. This is in a historical work that came out of the Sixth Dynasty period, which followed the Three Kingdoms, and I'll talk about that. We don't know whether it's true or not, but it's indicative of the tension between these two sort of poles of Chinese civilization that we're talking about, the Wen, the civil, and the Wu, the military. So Cao Pi here is very much a sort of military strongman, and his brother Cao Zhi is very much more of a sort of literary civil type, Wen type. And supposedly Cao Pi wanted to embarrass his younger brother by commanding that he write a poem in the time it would take to take 7 steps. And supposedly it would be impossible to do. If he failed, everyone would see that he wasn't a very good poet, and he could be actually executed. He threatened him with execution. He didn't do this. But of course, since Cao Zhi is a literary genius, he was able to come up with a poem in 7 steps. And not only was he able to come up with a poem, he was able to come up with a poem that used something nearby, a pot of cooking beans, as a metaphor to criticize his brother for trying to harm him. Right? That is, you have a bean plant, and you put the beans inside the pot, and you take the stalks of the bean plant, and you use it to stoke the fire under the pot. You're using the plant from the same root to hurt yourself. Right? And so the metaphor, of course, is that you and I come from the same root, we come from a common father, and yet you're trying to harm me. So not only is he successful in making the poem, he's successful in using it to embarrass his brother. And the narrative closes by saying the emperor flushed deeply with embarrassment, which is a nice moment where the sort of this figurehead of the emperor is supposed to be all powerful is suddenly flushed with blood, right? And you see he's human too, and he realizes he has human shame that he tried to hurt his younger brother. Because his younger brother lives another day. So that's, once again, a literary account. Don't know if it's true, but it captures a larger tension, which is very real in Chinese culture between the civil and the military. So the response in this time of chaos, the Three Kingdoms, the downfall of the Han Dynasty, and uncertain future, with many officials, as I said, retreated from public life. And 7 of them got together, and they called themselves the 7 Stages of the Downward Road. And they were quite famous for being extremely eccentric. They were into all sorts of strange drugs, and alcohol, sex, and music, and pure philosophical conversations and so forth. A lot of fun, if you can afford it, I suppose, but also for them a matter of personal safety. Right? When they were involved in political life, their days would be numbered, so they thought it best to set aside politics and talk about pure metaphysics and culture. So what was happening politically, though, is North China was breaking apart, and there were a succession of, I think someone counted up 21 different kingdoms and dynasties in the north part of China, from 304 to 439. I'm not going to go through all of those, but here's a map that shows some of them. So after the downfall of the Han Dynasty, and then breaks up into 3 kingdoms, and then those 3 kingdoms are never able to fully claim all of the previous territory of China, and they too start breaking up. The consolidation of Chinese ruling families in the south, what's called the Qin Dynasty, and in the north part of China is ruled by a bunch of different kingdoms and dynasties controlled by non-Chinese people. The 2 major groups are the Xiongnu and the Xianbei. There's a Chinese term Wu, which is often translated as barbarian, which sort of classifies 5 different groups of people. The 2 main ones are the Xianbei and the Shengnu. The Sheng theories of the Shengnu actually related to the Huns, like the Toba Han and so forth, further west. But anyway, the Xianbei. The Toba, so the Toba is a subgroup of the Xianbei people, these are non-Chinese people in the north, and the northern way becomes the sort of most stable of these northern kingdoms. So who are these people? They kind of speak a mixture of, try to tell, Turkish and Mongolian, an Altaic language, nothing to do with Chinese whatsoever. There are no written records of it. Unfortunately, there's some Chinese attempts to transliterate it. That's about it. And many of these people that are listed here, Xiang and other groups, many of these people already live within the borders of what used to be the Chinese Empire under the Han Dynasty. So it's not like a Roman model where there was a center of empire and barbarians coming from without. The people that were, called later as barbarians were actually living within China at the time. It's just there was a shift of power away from the Chinese ruling families who left the north and went to the south towards the non-Chinese ruling families. So there wasn't really an invasion so much as a sort of change in management, I suppose, in northern China. And one theory is that these people, the Shengnu and the Xianbei, were militarily superior to the Chinese forces at the time. And not only in their training with horses and cavalry, but also the use of stirrups and crossbows, and they had technology which gave them a sort of military edge. So they were able to take control for the military needs in North China. While the sort of cultural, civil, elite ruling families left the North of China to get away from that and went to south. So there's at this point a kind of break between North and South China along those sort of lines of civil and military thought. So before I talk about the South, I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the northern Wei Kingdom, the Toba Wei Kingdom. And we have some artifacts from that time. It's an interesting society. It's very much a hybrid society. So the majority of people living there are Chinese, but the ruling sort of elite are the Xianbei Toba people. And it's a military rather than a civil society, so there's a kind of new class structure that's put into place where military households are part of the ruling elite. And the Chinese populace is considered as necessary in order to clothe and feed the military class, right, the farmers. Although there is a lot of intermarriage between the two groups, and there's a lot of mobility across ethnic lines, and there's this kind of oscillation of ethnicity where the ruling house at some points is proud of Xianbei Toba heritage and sort of makes everyone dress that way, and then other times they start moving a bit further south, and they take on Chinese characteristics and start, at one point the Xianbei even take on Chinese surnames and sort of convert the Wei kingdom into a Chinese kingdom. So there's this kind of shifting racial identities among the people at the time. And some people sort of playing both cards, right? Being more Xianbei when dealing with Xianbei and being more Chinese when dealing with Chinese. So very much a hybrid culture. It's expressed in the material culture as well. So there's some interesting artifacts that come out of this time. So the hybridization here, I suppose, this is a very famous stone sarcophagus, a lid to the stone sarcophagus that has intricate carving on it. This is an ink rubbing, where there's the rice paper on it and coat it with ink to get the relief picture, and then this is the negative of that. I think that's the scene right here. And so the style of this kind of wavy, very fluid style with all these curved lines and so forth, is a new style that's coming from outside of China at the time. But the content, what the story is about, a boy, a grandson named Yuanfu, is strictly Confucian, very traditional Confucian story. So here's a nice example of kind of non-Chinese form, but the content is extremely Chinese. And it's a very famous story of a family, and the grandfather in the family is getting old and decrepit, and everyone's getting tired of taking care of him. So the parents, the son of the grandfather and his wife, take the grandfather on a little sort of wheelbarrow or platform. Actually, it's supposed to be a wheelbarrow, I thought. But anyway, they take him out to the edge of town and they dump him in the edge of town there in the fields, in the wilderness, to die. And they come back home. And Yunfu, the little grandson, is looking for his grandfather. And he can't find him. He goes out and he looks for him. His grandfather dies, but he takes the wheelbarrow and he brings it back home. And his parents go, get that thing out of here, we don't want to see that. You know, put that back where you found it. He said, well, I brought it home today, and I need it to leave it all. And I have to take you or something. And then, of course, his parents are like, oh my God, what have we done? And they go up, they rescue Grandpa, and they bring it back. And so Young then always held up as sort of very filial grandson. You can see the convergence between the idea of filiality and humaneness, or benevolence. So that's a nice example of Chinese culture having a sort of expression in other ways here. Okay. So that's a little bit of what's going on in the north, this kind of hybrid culture where the Xianbei people are now sort of military leaders. It's not very stable. There are many different kingdoms, as I said, at least 20 over the course of a century and a half. And then there's something that happens that's the sort of northern part here, called the Northern Dynasty. But what I want to switch to now is the Southern Dynasty. And there's a sort of mass migration when the Chinese lose control of the north. Around 317 onward, there's a migration towards the south of the Yangtze River, a region that used to be Wu and Shu, and the three kingdoms there. So the Wei kingdom is now completely in non-Chinese hands, and the Chinese ruling elites are on to the south. They established dynasties in the south, beginning with what's called the Eastern Jin, and then these five southern dynasties. Four southern dynasties, Song, Qi, Liang, and Shang. You don't have to know all of these, just know that there's a period called the Southern Dynasty, where the Chinese ruling elite had a capital in modern-day Nanjing, south of the Yangtze River. They were not as stable either. Geographically, it was stable. There's sort of southern China was under the rule of dynasties, and those dynasties didn't last very long. So first was Eastern Jin, and then the Song and Qi. The northern ones were a bit more geographically as well as temporally unstable. There was constant shifting of territory and so forth. Very confusing. But in the south, you have a kind of succession of one dynasty after the other. And the reason for the instability is many of these dynasties were actually not founded by a totally new sort of group of people coming in and defeating the old dynasties and